Good day, I'm Kroum Batchvarov and I'm a maritime archaeologist by profession, and this is my channel. I would like to talk about the connection between maritime archaeology and ship models, actually. In truth, this is a topic that we will be going back to quite frequently, I'm sure, for the two are intricately connected. Not only ship modelers are asking exactly the same questions that are of interest to us maritime archaeologists, but also much of the historical data that we have about especially the earlier period of ship, the vessels of the 17th century, the Restoration Navy. Much of this information is deduced also from contemporary ship models. In this case, as a starter, we will be talking about a type of vessel that was quite popular here in New England, where I am based, and existed for just about a century, give or take. And as a matter of fact, there are still some examples being sailed today, although mostly as pleasure boats rather than working craft anymore. I'm talking, of course, about the Pincke schooner. The word Pincke actually designates a number of different types of vessels and not necessarily schooner. Pincke is connected with the type of stern of the vessel, and in the past, Pinckes could be usually were square-rigged and could be carrying up to 3 masts. They were very popular in the English-speaking world from the 17th century for sure, all the way into the 18th century. They were part of that large family of broadly similar vessels, together with the flouts, with the cats and other Baltic carriers. They always were merchant vessels, cargo-carrying vessels, usually modest in size and also requiring fairly small crews and therefore cheap to operate. Fast forward to the 19th century and to across the Atlantic Ocean into the fisheries in America. Without going into a long dissertation on the development of the fishing vessels of New England, after all, this is an interesting but very extensive topic and not all that well documented, as a matter of fact. The probable predecessor of the Pincke schooner was the Chebacco boat, if we are to trust Howard Chappell, probably the foremost researcher into the fishing fleets of New England and the North American coast in general. Howard Chappell is a fantastic source of information. He is incredibly good illustrator. He was a yacht designer. He was a collector of data information. He was a very prolific writer. Unfortunately, he was not what you would call modern style scholar. And much of this knowledge, much of this incredible collection of data that he has imparted through his books is not documented. So we have only his own word for developments for types of vessels. The second shortcoming of Chappell's works is that being a brilliant draftsman and really good yacht designer, he always had very strong opinions of how ships' drawings should be, how they should look like, and what will make a better vessel, and did not hesitate to, quote-unquote, improve the drawings and the original sources that he had at his disposal. And again, unfortunately, he never specifies what is his reconstruction or improvement and what is based on original data. So fantastic as he is as a source material, it should always be taken with a grain of salt, shall we say. To some extent, this is true of the Pincke schooners also. So first of all, what makes it the Pincke schooner? It is the stern. The stern has to be rounded. The stern in this case is quite characteristic, and this really is slightly different from the traditional interpretation of what a Pincke stern is. In this case, in North America, what really makes it the Pincke schooner is this narrowing of the rails and ending with the typical transom known as tombstone. if you look at it in profile, it becomes obvious why it is called tombstone, because it bloody well looks like one. It is an interesting type of vessel. They were fairly small. It appears that the earliest references to Pincke schooners versus Chebacco boats do not date until the 1820s, or in other words, after the end of the War of 1812. At first they were intended to be fairly small vessels. The largest of them probably never exceeded 55-ish to 60 feet at the most registered length. They changed in rig, but the changes that happened to these vessels were rather incremental, certainly not revolutionary. They did not develop much in shape, they did not develop much in construction. They only deck furniture, equipment changed, but overall the class retained its characteristics throughout its existence. And as I said earlier, some examples of the Pincke schooners continued working all the way into the 20th century, and now are fairly popular pleasure boats. They were a development from the earlier fishing boats because fishermen started needing to go farther offshore. Especially after the War of 1812, some disagreements or misunderstandings, call it whatever you want, between the British interpretation of fishing rights and the American fishing rights essentially made Americans go poaching into Canadian territorial waters. And something that, of course, we would have been deeply offended if somebody did it to our fisheries. The point of fact, however, is that this required slightly larger vessels that could keep the sea for longer periods of time, and at the same time had to be fairly fast to escape the wrath of the offended Canadian fishermen, not to mention Coast Guard. That is also where the Pincke schooner comes into play. The increased sail plans certainly would have added speed and maneuverability in comparison with the earlier boats. The most important characteristic for this type of vessel was windward ability, the ability to sail close to the wind. And in this, Pincke's excelled. I will use this model to illustrate some of the characteristics of the type. This is based on a kit manufactured by the American manufacturer Model Shipways. And as a matter of fact, it is an outstanding kit, but I will discuss the qualities of the kit in a little bit. The model was built by Batchvarov, and the series of videos, you can see a link to them in the corner of this video. Without further ado, as I mentioned, the main characteristic of these vessels, it had to be capability of sailing to windward. They are not particularly great on, they are not that fast on all points of sail. They were optimized for sailing to windward, both to reach the Gulf of St. Lawrence and to return home. In both directions, essentially, the vessels had to be beating against the wind all the time. They likely would not be quite so good downwind for the very simple reason that they have fairly narrow sterns, so they are likely to squat. They had pretty significant differential between the draft forward and the draft aft. The lines of the vessel, as you can see, has an extremely long, sharp run towards the rudder. That, for many years, was believed to increase the speed and to make a vessel more maneuverable. And to some extent, there is some truth in this, of course. Even nowadays, we agree with this. But probably in this case, it was carried out to an extreme. The heavily raking stern post would have allowed the helm to be minded on its own, to be left alone, and to stay in neutral position if left on its own. The rigging of the vessels and the sail plans could vary slightly. This is the very basic, the simplest version of the rig, which consisted, as you can see, of foresail, mainsail, and a large staysail or jib, call it whichever you want. In truth, one possibility to increase the sail area was the addition of what eventually would become known as the fisherman's staysail, in this case for main topsail, main topmast staysail. Specifically, this example does not carry it and does not even have the gaff topsail, which some of the larger boats of this type began to carry towards the later periods of their career. Another characteristic of the type, besides the very, very typical stern, and actually rather graceful stern, if I may say so, was the open rails. Usually there was an opening immediately above the waterways and under the cap rail. There were openings, also characteristic of the type of vessel. This specific model is essentially converted into a yacht. That is why the deck houses, the original fishing working class vessel, would not have had the forward structure. It would have had hatches for the fish. It would have had some sort of a raised deck in the forward end, accommodation for the crew. The larger Pincke schooners carried crews of up to 7 people, including a cook and the captain. The rest of the crew involved with the fishing. So that would have been one of the changes. In the early versions, the cooking was done essentially on accumulation of bricks laid down on the deck, and the smokestack was simply a wooden chimney. By the mid-19th century, this has changed. They started carrying cast iron ranges, and therefore you begin to see metal chimneys sticking above the deck, as is on this example. But they retain their position in the forward end of the vessel. In the stern area, and this kit shows it with a cockpit, that is an original feature. This is where the steersman would have stayed during the sailing of the vessel. In the stern also there would have been a hatch opening into a lazarette where most of the water casks were kept, and spare gear, although it is also characteristic of the type that breakers of water would be carried on deck, usually around the mainmast, but not necessarily. This obviously could vary depending on the choices of the officers and owners of the boat. Another 2 things that should be pointed out are that from where the camera is, this probably is not visible, but it is quite visible in the videos on the construction of the model. But the sheets for both the foresail and the mainsail are running along horses in the back. The horses are wooden made, but especially the mainsail horse usually had an iron bar on the lower face, because the ring on which the blocks for the sheet were running back and forth along this beam, rubbing against the iron, were not wearing out the timber of the wooden horse, and yet the timber of the horse is what gave it its strength. On the upper face of the horse, there were holes drilled into which essentially belaying pins could be mounted. And these belaying pins were used the way that we use modern blocks and tackle systems for shifting the position of the mainsail block. Essentially, this was what was adjusting or fine-tuning the rig. Quite ingenious, quite simple, quite cheap, quite easy to make at home. The same system, to a large extent, was used also on the foresail. It should be pointed out that theoretically, at least, it was possible, and in earlier vessels it is sometimes visible, especially on the Chebacco boats, for the foresail to be without a boom, and therefore to slightly overlap the mainsail. By the period of the height of the use of the Pincke schooners, however, this has changed and they were boomed. The usage of horses is quite obviously an adjustment, so an improvement, allowing the vessel to be sailed short-handed, practically single-handed, while the rest of the crew is busy with the fishing. This varied slightly for the foresail, or as the British would have called it, foresail in this case, the jib or the staysail, call it whatever you want. In this particular example, there also is a horse for that sheet, but quite often in the original fishing adjustment, there will be 2 sheets with blocks and tackles led to each of the sides of the vessel, rather than on a horse. In this case, the bowsprit is made of a single timber, In later periods, theoretically, it could have a jib boom. I'm not aware of many examples of using jib booms. The vessels had simple plain gammon knee at the top of the stem, which incidentally is not included on this vessel. And at least until the 1840s, the gammoning, what tied the bowsprit to the stem of the vessel, was made out of hemp cable, tightly wound in place. After the 1840s, however, essentially gammoning iron, an iron strap, was used to keep the bowsprit on top. Howard Chappell lists at least one example in which also gammon boards were attached to the sides of the vessel, but again, this was rarity. It was the exception to the rule, and there is no recording of a figurehead ever being mounted on such a boat. Not that the ship modeler cannot add it on their own. After all, I have seen an Ericsson 29 with a figurehead. Hardly the vessel that you would expect to carry a figurehead. Gradually, however, the size limitations of the boats spelled there, and by the second half of the 19th century, fishermen needed larger vessels, usually the marble modifications of the Marblehead and the heel tapper schooners. The waters into which they fished moved farther out, farther offshore, and the limitations of the class was really in the dimensions. So gradually they fall from grace. It is quite notable, the largest number of registered Pincke schooners was in the late 1820s. And by the late 1860s, we see a remarkable drop down to single digits of registered Pincke's for the fishing industry. This, again, I repeat, this is specifically for fishing working purposes. This does not mean that the vessels disappeared. After all, if you look through Wooden Boat magazine, you will see that even in quite recent times, some examples were built of the type. I'll be happy to answer any questions, and I'll be happy to address any types of vessels that the viewers may be interested in. And now, let us talk a little bit about the kit. The quality of the kit is quite impressive. It is giving opportunity to build two types of model, either the simplified beginners or middle-level ship modelers by simply following straightforward through the kit, or thanks to the extensive and detailed drawings that are provided in the box, one is able to heavily modify the kit to the point where it will produce a high-end model. In this case, the ship modeler Batchvarov chose to develop the model into more advanced stage, but then she is a master modeler. The sails are entirely her signature. Her models are always easy to recognize by the extensive rigging and the incredible quality of the sails that she provides, but they do not come with the kit. The kit is intended to be with bare spars, as seems to be quite often the preference for many modelers and collectors. Part of the reason, of course, is that it is quite hard to make the sails look realistically in scale and to be realistically filled. Usually, they do not look right. In this case, I believe the master shipwright has achieved perfection in this. I bought this kit for Olia for two reasons. First of all, it seemed rather appropriate. She had just moved to New England, and this is the sort of vessel that you see in New England. And we are living literally a few hundred yards from the waterfront, so what could be more appropriate? In our port, Pincke schooners would have been visible once upon a time. Second, and rather more prosaic reason, is that her shop was not yet quite completed and outfitted with tools, so it had to be something simpler that can easily be built. Or so I naively thought. And then, of course, Olia decided to improve the kit and changed some of the planking, specifically on the deck. Then, of course, the ropes provided with the kit were below her standards, perfectly fine as they may be, so she used her rope walk to twist the entire cordage for the vessel. Both the running and the standing rigging is entirely her product. The sails, as I said before, this is not something that comes with the kit, this was also Olia's addition. But in such a simple, otherwise model, sails do make a lot of difference. They're very hard to model, to do it right, but in this case they add dramatically to the model. I can't imagine the same visual attraction, the kit, without the sails. Was it my dream to have a 19th century Pincke schooner in my house? It is appropriate, but hardly. I am a 17th century specialist mostly, and that is what I truly love. Maybe one day Olia will build a 17th century model for me. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your attention, and please do let me know in the comments below what other topics would you like to see addressed on the channel in the future issues. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.